Welcome to Money and Me. This week my guest is one of the UK's top financial journalists and the winner of the Financial Commentator of the Year award, Claer Barrett. Claer, welcome to Money and Me.
Thanks for having me, Graham.
Now, we have a female Doctor Who now, so I think I'm in my rights to ask you to take us in your TARDIS back to your childhood and just tell me a little bit about the kind of family environment you grew up in, and whether money was ever a topic of conversation with your parents.
More a way of life, I would say, than a topic of conversation. I mean, I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, and back then, unlike now, only one parent worked, my dad, and my mum gave up work to raise me and my brother, and my mum and dad both work as teachers, so they didn't have very much money, neither of their families had very much money, and my goodness, we knew that we didn't have much money, but it wasn't ever portrayed to us in a bad light or a negative light. Sure, you know, there were friends of mine at school, especially when I got older and became a teenager, who had like Nike Air trainers. I can remember when they first came out and my dad saying £45, you know, for a pair of trainers. So there was no way that I was ever going to get a pair of trainers, because that wasn't something that they placed any value on. However, they did buy me a saxophone when I was 13, which cost £600, and that involved many years of saving up and help from grandma. But until I had an accident and nearly knocked one of my teeth out when I was a bit older, you know, that was what I was going to do for a career. You know, I was intent on becoming, you know, a professional musician. Oh, wow. And so it's a bit like the John Lewis advert now, with like the child Elton being given a piano by his grandparents. So they were very focused on spending money on the right things, and they still are, and I still am now. And you know, I'm lucky enough to earn now, in terms of like my annual salary and pension and everything, like way in excess of what either of my parents ever earned in their lifetime. They're both now retired, but I am still as stingy as hell.
so they drummed that into you from early doors.
Oh yeah, and in particular, I mean, they're both really good at it, but my dad's really good at it, and we text each other all the time saying, oh, you know, Sparks Points promotions, or, you know, well, this is happening, or there's a very good offer on wine in a particular supermarket, because he's retired now, so he's got a lot more time to search out the best ways of spending his money. But it was always made into a fun thing. Like, I can remember we used to drive in the 80s a mile away to a farm that sold trays of cracked eggs. I mean, you wouldn't be able to legally sell or eat them, you know, now in the kind of like post-Salmonella era, but it was a great adventure. You know, off we go, off to the farm in our wellies, and, you know, go and buy a tray of cracked eggs for like 20 pence or something ridiculous. So they were very frugal, my parents, but they made saving money fun.
Okay, so at what point does the saxophone give way to the typewriter and you become a journalist?
Well, when I was at school, you probably won't believe this, but I was actually incredibly shy. And when I went to secondary school, it was almost like the worst thing that ever happened to me, because I was surrounded by all of these children that I didn't know. There were hardly any people from my school who'd gone to this school. And so for the first couple of years, it was just all about sort of like survival and staying out of the way of the big girls in the year above, who used to come across to me as being particularly frightening. Anyway, one day at school, I was wearing my Dr. Martin boots, which are still fashionable now, but then especially, you know, at the age of 13, I had my first pair of Dr. Martens, which I've saved up for ages to get. And one of the teachers came up to me and said, oh, Barrett, you know, I don't think girls should be allowed to wear these boots because they don't look very feminine. And I said, well, you know, they're a lot better for your feet, sir, than wearing high heels, which some of my contemporaries were already wearing at that stage. Anyway, this went further, and the school decided to ban girls from wearing Dr. Martin boots. And this is basically what transformed me from a shy and retiring person who wouldn't really like to even speak in class for fear of making an idiot of herself, to becoming you know, a warrior for justice in the campaign for girls to wear DMs. And I got up a petition, I phoned up the local paper, I was like queuing up every morning outside the staff room to tell the teachers, you know, what was happening. I became the most popular person in the school, like practically overnight, because everyone wore DMs, it wasn't just me. And everyone just got behind this campaign, and we won, and they overturned it and said, you know, this is ridiculous. Some of the female teachers especially got behind it and said, you can't tell girls that wearing DMs with a skirt is unfeminine. I still wear DMs now, and I suspect I will do for some time to come. But that was what it took to make me think, oh, I'm so angry about this. Yeah. I'm going to fight for it to be changed, and overcome my shyness. And I think that for me, that's really what a lot of really good journalism is all about. It's about noticing and shining a light on something that isn't fair. And unfortunately, within the world of finance, and particularly personal finance, there is an awful lot of stuff that falls under that category. Yeah. And trying to change something, bring it into the public interest and do some good.
Excellent. Okay. Well, obviously you went to university. You did.
Eventually, I worked for 2 years before I went to university. I didn't want to go to university.
Ah, right. Okay. But eventually you succumbed because you also did a master's degree.
I did, yes.
And then you ended up actually going into, I think, property journalism initially after graduating. Is that correct?
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, because at that time I was still trying to make it as a musician. You see, so I wasn't interested in academia, and I decided, okay, I will go to university, but I'll go in London because that's where all the bands are. And then I joined the university newspaper, and that was kind of it. So I thought, okay, writing, but I still didn't think I'd be any good at it. And so I thought, well, I'll stick to working as a secretary because that's what I was doing for my good job, get out of debt. And you could make very good money being a secretary, and there were lots of jobs. And the temping agency, in fact, just round the corner from this skyscraper, the very insightful person who booked me said, what do you actually want to do for a career now that you've finished your degree? And I said, well, I want to be a journalist, but you're not going to get me a job as that. And she said, well, I can get you secretary to the editor of a trade magazine. So the next day I started there, and within 3 months I got on the graduate trainee scheme.
Wow, okay.
That was it.
So that was serendipitous. So you already kind of wanted to be a journalist, you just didn't think you had an avenue into it, and then you got there through a secretarial role, and then managed to impress them with your writing skills and
organisation. I think, to be a journalist, you need to be really, really well organised. Right. I mean, to be good at running your own personal finances, it's also a key skill. One of the reasons that I am so organised is because I had a really horrible experience when I was 17, and I got the day wrong for one of my A-levels. I wasn't particularly careful in those days about things like whether it was a Tuesday or a Thursday, and I can remember I was at home, I just got out of bed, and Mr. Goff phoned up from school and said, Barrett, why aren't you here? And I was like, well, because my exam's on Thursday. And he said, no, it's just started. And I managed to knock on all of the neighbours' doors and get one of them to take me to the school. I hadn't really done the right revision because I'd left all of that to the last minute as well. And they let me into the exam, which was very kind of them. I'm sure they bent the rules, and I still passed. So I had enough, but it could easily have gone the other way, and that was the most important exam of all of the A-levels I was taking.
That got you organised.
I felt wretched for the whole rest of the summer waiting for those results, and I just thought I never ever want anything like this to happen to me ever again. So it was the kick in the bum that I needed to actually grow up and say I have to be responsible for my own destiny. Right. So, but to go back to being a secretary, I am an amazing secretary. If I ever fail in journalism, then I'd be quite happy to go back to doing that, because it was a job I loved, and working for a huge office full of journalists who all had too much to do, not enough time, too many stories, and were throwing tasks at me. I'm still in touch with all of the people from those days, and it was just a fantastic way of learning about things. And also, being good on the phone is a skill in journalism and in life, which is very overlooked. And nowadays, it's all to do with emails and having people's mobiles and texting them. And I often say to young reporters in my team, why don't you just phone them up? Because you might get more out of them if you have a conversation rather than just exchanging electronic messages. And because I'd done telesales for years, I was very good at getting people on the phone. And when I became a reporter, this was a definite advantage.
Excellent. Okay. Well, what I want to do after the break is go into a bit more detail about one of your real passions, which is financial education. So for now, thank you very much, and do join us again in a few moments. Welcome back. Before the break, we found out about how Claire's education had prepared her for a career in journalism. Now we want to talk about a subject I know is close to her heart, and that is financial education. Now, Claire, your mission, as you stated it, is to demystify the world of finance. Why do you think that's so important?
Well, I think that large tranches of the financial services industry, sadly, have the mission of mystifying it for us so that we all then pay them to explain it back to us. And there are a lot of products, especially pensions, where the rules are very complicated, but also the level of jargon involved just makes the average person switch off, not want to understand how things work, which means that they're going to get a worse deal. But it's also the case in something like energy bills and, choosing a tariff, and, there are hundreds and hundreds of different ones. Or even if you were to be quite advanced about your finances and pick a stocks and shares ISA, for example, there are potentially many hundreds of funds or other products that you could choose to put in to that product. So having all of this choice is great, but it also means that we have to make a decision. And I think my fear is that for a lot of people, making no decision is the default option, and that can actually be a much worse outcome than if they'd made a decision that perhaps wasn't the best, but was quite good, but making no decision at all, particularly when it comes to saving up money for the future.
Well, exactly. I mean, one of the things I'm seeing people do since our great sort of pension freedoms is they're taking money out of a really tax-efficient pension wrapper and sticking it in a high street bank account and getting 0.1% and thinking they've made a smart move.
But then if you look at the forces that are driving that, perhaps, number one is stock markets around the world are falling, and there's been some really heavy falls in the last few days at the time of speaking to you, which spooks people, and they think, well, I'd rather get my money out and have it in cash. So it's not just about understanding the stock market, it's about understanding the risk process and when you might need that money. And like the money in my stocks and shares ISA, I'm 41 now, and I know that things are going up and down. I haven't even looked at it in the last 6 weeks because I don't want to know. I've made my decisions and I will stand by them because I don't intend to take a penny out of that account until I am well over the age of 60, in an ideal world. It's nice to have it there in case something bad happens, and I need it before then. But you really have to think about investing in pensions in terms of decades instead of months. But the people who are taking cash out and putting it in the high street bank, they think that cash is safe, and women especially are real lovers of cash products, not just for themselves, but also women are more likely to open junior ISAs in a family situation where there are children, and they're also more likely to put those in cash, whereas that's an investment that's tied up for 18 years. So it's just going to go backwards in terms of inflation. But then it all comes back to decisions again. If you have to decide what funds to put your children's junior ISA in, which one do you choose? This one, that one, there are hundreds, can't make a decision. The result, the default, do nothing. And then their money goes backwards.
So how can we overcome this? Because I know particularly financial education of women has been a topic that's close to your heart. One of the tactics you've used for that, which seems to be working very well, is this concept of the kind of online money diary. Tell me how that's worked.
Yeah, so people talk about women's finances because there are lots of statistics about the gender pay gap and the gender pensions gap, which is related, and also the fact that fewer women actually invest than men. And I think we have to be very careful, Graham, about saying that women don't invest because they can't do it or they won't do it. I don't think that's the case. There are many reasons that prevent women from investing. One of them could be that they're just not earning enough. A second one could be that they lack the confidence to do so, and that they particularly want more face-to-face assurance from an advisor. Say that's come out in surveys as being much more important, whereas men might be happy to do their own research and do something online. And of course, face-to-face financial advice is horrifically expensive in this country. We talk about the advice gap, and I do think that is a big problem. But when it comes to why women need to think about their finances, sorry, we were talking about the money diaries. Let me start that again. So in terms of why finance is such a crucial issue for women, the editor of the Money Diaries website in America says that money is the last taboo holding back working women. And I think this is true because, as we've seen with the gender pay gap, how do you know what your colleagues are earning, whether they're female or male? Do you have any idea about what process you need to go through in your company to get a pay rise? Who you would need to ask? Are you asking the right person? Is there indeed a chance that you could move up, move sideways within the company, grow your career? And these are all questions that women feel, and men, feel a bit shady about asking. So the whole idea of the money diaries is to give a woman an anonymous spending diary covering 7 days, at the outset of which they provide a rough kind of balance sheet of their life, like how much they're earning, which is a question that you feel you can never ask people, how much debt they have, which people can often be more boastful about, I find, in public company when it comes to talking about how big your mortgage is and things like that, but less so when it comes to credit cards, which is seen as a source of shame, and also the kind of things that they're spending on day to day. And it is absolutely addictive reading, getting an insight into somebody's spending habits, particularly if they're on a fantastic wage, a tech worker in California, or on the other hand, if they don't have very much money and they're putting brunch on their credit card, and the online commentators have a field day and say, oh, you know, how could you do this? But by reading about what our peers are doing and where they're going right and where we're going wrong, it's actually emerged as a fantastic source of financial education without it being bound up, prescribed, put in some, you know, I get sent these dreadful books all the time about read this and become a money expert. I just think the kind of people who need to read this book, they're never going to buy a book about becoming a money maestro, let alone actually finish reading it. But these diaries, they're kind of entertaining, but they're also insightful. So you're reading about how other women are handling their money and getting sort of like ideas, either by example, good or bad, and taking something away from that. So it's a completely new way of doing that. And as the Financial Times money editor, I think that entertainment is a really important part of what we're doing in our journalism, in the FT Weekend. Because if you're publishing articles that are quite dry and boring, yes, the information has got to be correct. But in order for people, whether they're male or female, to want to read that article and apply it to their life, it's got to be somewhat tantalising and interesting to read. You know, what am I going to get out of this if I read this piece? Well, you could feel a lot better about your finances, rather than the big sort of nagging finger of doom saying don't spend any money on avocados.
Okay, but I mean, which brings me on to my next subject, which is moving on from women and the financial issue to the next generation, and again talking about making it interesting. A lot of millennials that I speak to or see interviewed seem to find the whole topic very dull and boring. So how can we get them more engaged in their financial future?
Well, I'd go further than that, Graham. I think they find it traumatic. And certainly the focus groups and things that we've done at the FT with younger readers, they're just pumped full of, your generation is the one that's going to get it in the neck, your pensions are rubbish or non-existent, your salary, because you started a job in the recession, is never going to grow in any meaningful way, you're never going to be able to afford to buy a property, you're going to be renting this global asset class for the rest of your life. So why would you try and be good with money? You may as well just spend it all on a nice holiday and, Instagramming your avocado brunch or whatever. And I can totally understand that rejection and saying, well, what's the point? Because we're never going to have the things that previous generations have had. So there's a lot of negativity. But you have to try and build on that and say it's not as hopeless as you think. And there are things that you can do. And one of the main ways that people can help themselves is by joining their workplace pension. Now, we do a presentation at the FT every year aimed at our younger staff, where we explain to people that paying into a pension actually costs a lot less than you might think, because A, you pay less tax because you get tax relief, and B, for the amount you put in, your company will normally put in the same amount or match it or even put in some more. So when you actually look at the numbers, which are very hard to get out of companies, what will the number in the bottom right-hand corner of my paycheck actually show if I join the pension scheme? That is the question that I wish I'd known the answer to when I started my first job. I was trying to buy a house, I was saving up, and I just thought, I'm not going to do the company pension scheme. big mistake. I also thought that I would only be at that company for 2 years. In the end, I was there for 7.
Yeah. And of course, I think what you said from even when you're from your childhood is if you can get into that discipline of saving regularly with the miracle of compounding and long-term investing, you can turn a small amount into a very big pension chunk for when you retire.
Absolutely. And in my presentation that I do, I have a picture of a snowball at the top of a mountain, because I think that's the best way of explaining compound interest. The earlier you start, even if you only have a snowball, by the time you retire, which let's face it might not be until your late 70s or even 80s for some people the way we're going, that would have grown. So even putting away small amounts, the industry is calling it micro investing, and there are now lots of apps where you can do things like round up your spare change. So you're putting a couple of pounds a day into a stocks and shares ISA money box. I just think brilliant. You know, it's an innovative product, and it's engaging with a new market of consumers who are very different from the ones that went before.
That's great advice to end our time together on. Claer Barrett, thank you very much indeed. Join us again next week on Money and Me for more financial insights from another financial leader.